All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. And as part of the Rankin Technical College Application and Website Development, or AWD 1111 Database Driven Web Development class, I've been creating a series of videos based on some of the PDFs from Mr. Flavio Cope's The Valley of Code. So far, I have gone through and done 5 videos on the HTML handbook. And I've done about 10 videos on the CSS handbook, and I'm in the middle of this CSS series. Afterward, I'm going to go through the JavaScript handbook, go through some JavaScript programs, possibly build a website or two, then jump, because that's all client side, then jump into the server side stuff where we'll go through the Node.js handbook and the React handbook. So that's where we stand right now. All right. And I left off, let's see, right here, talking about display. And as it says, the display property of an object determines how it is rendered by the browser. All right. So we've talked a little bit about this already. If you remember when we looked at our website, all right, that we went and we changed this. So if I go back in and I take a look at our styles.css and we look at the anchor tags for our navigation unordered list items, it's display block. When you display something as a block, what you're typically doing is you're taking something that would normally be displayed, all right, over multiple lines, and you're displaying it as on a single line. That's what we're doing right there. All right, so there's block, there's inline, there's none, there's contents, there's flow, etc. There's even inline block. So there's a lot of them, as you can see here. All right. It says choosing any of these will considerably alter the behavior of the browser within the element and its children. So in this section, they're going to talk about what he considers, all right, the most important ones, those being inline block, and none. It says we'll see some in the later chapters because later on in this chapter, they're going to go over 2 newer CSS types of ways of working, and those being CSS Grid and Flexbox. So inline, as it says, is the default display for virtually every element in CSS. All tags are displayed inline out of the box. All right, except ones like div, p, section, etc., which are set to block. So remember, if something is displayed inline, it's meant to go on one line. Block meaning it's meant to go on multiple lines. All right. It says their inline items don't have any margin or padding applied. The same for the height and width. Now it says you can add them, but the appearance in the page won't change. What that means is you won't have a bunch of extra lines, etc., and they won't be taking up 100% of the width. All right. They are calculated and applied automatically by the browser. Inline block, as it says, similar to inline, but the width and height are applied as specified. Block, as it says, as mentioned, normally items are displayed inline with the exception of things like this. These are set to block by the browser. With display block, they're stacked one after each other vertically and take up 100% of the page. All right. So the values assigned to width and height, as it says, are respected as you set them, and display none makes the element disappear from the browser. Now, this is an important concept. When you display none, notice it makes it disappear. It's still there in the HTML, but it's hidden from the browser until you change the display. All right, positioning, as it says, this is probably one of the more hinky types of thing in here with CSS because, as it says, it determines where elements appear on the screen and how they appear. All right, so some of the different positionings, the 5 main ones are going to be discussed here. Now, I'm going to talk about all 5. I will tell you in my own comings and goings that basically I have had my share of problems with the last one, that being sticky. Okay. Static, notice, is the default. Statically positioned elements are displayed in the normal page flow. So they go right to left, up and down, etc., as long as there's room. Relative, if you set position relative, you are now able to position it with an offset using the properties that are shown here, also referred to as the offset properties. All right. They accept a length value or a percentage. It says, take this example I made on CodePen. I create a parent container, a child container, and an inner box with some text. Well, let's take a look at it. There it is. So what have we got here? We've got a parent, and that should be on the outside. That's what's in purple. We've got a child, which is inside of that, and we've got a box, which is inside of that. All right, so there's the CSS for it. And all we have basically is an outer div called parent, a div inside of that called child, and a div inside of the child called box with the word test in it. All right. So you'll notice if we take a look here, let's see, we've got background color, padding, and width, background color and padding, background padding, a border. All right. Nothing special really about this. I think everybody would be able to go in and create something, or at least hopefully could create something that looked like that. All right. And it says there, they added some CSS to give some colors and some padding, but it does not affect the positioning. You saw that. And there was the result. You saw that as well. It says you can try and add any of the properties mentioned and nothing will happen because the position is static. Now, if you set the position relative to the box, it says at first apparently nothing changes, but the element is now able to move using the top, left, and bottom properties. So you can see what's happening here. All right. And a little later, we'll talk about something called the Z index, but that's almost what we're doing right here. Even though this box is inside of, or this div is inside of this div and inside of this div, since its position is relative, now we can use those properties that were discussed before, those being top, right, bottom, and left, to move it around on the screen. So it started like this. Since it was static, we had no positioning set. This was basically stuck inside of here. But now we can do this. Bottom would have put it down here, right, left, etc. So a negative value at the top will make it move up. All right, and notice, so we still got that negative value, but now we got a left, so we moved it up and over. And as it says, notice how the space that is occupied by the box remains preserved in the container, like it was still in place. Now here, it says another property that we will work on is the Z index to alter the Z-axis placement. We'll talk about that later on. One thing about working with Z indexes, now you're talking about doing something three-dimension. You've got your X-axis, you've got your Y-axis, and now you've got your Z-axis, which basically runs kind of diagonally. And what the Z index will allow you to do, excuse me, what the Z index will allow you to do then is it will allow you to take something and make it the way this is the way the way that I talk about this. It allows you to take something and bring it from the background to the foreground. The higher the Z index, the more in the foreground it is. All right. Setting position absolute on an element will remove it from the document's flow, and it'll basically no longer move. It says, remember in relative positioning that we noticed the space even if it moved around. With absolute positioning, as soon as the position absolute is on the box, its original space is now collapsed. Okay? So now you can move the box around as you want. This kind of shrunk, for lack of better words, and now you can move this basically any place. So notice with the top 0 and bottom 0 with position absolute, it's going to stay in the upper left-hand corner. And we've talked about this earlier, that unlike when you work with math, you've got the math axis, you've got your Y and your X, and you've got your point of origin right in the middle. The point of origin, the 0, 0 in here is always in the upper left-hand corner. So you'll notice that with the absolute, we can even move it so it's outside of the box. All right. So this means that if we add the position relative to the child and we set the top and left to 0, the box will not be positioned at the top left of the window. Rather, it'll be positioned at 0, 0 coordinates of the child. So you can get some different kinds of effects, all right, when you use this. Like with absolute positioning, when an element is assigned position fixed, it is removed from the regular page flow. It says the difference with absolute positioning is this: the element always is positioned relative to the window rather than the first non-static container. So there's 0, 0 versus 0, 0. Another big difference, as it says there, is that the elements are not affected by scrolling. All right, it says once you put a sticky element somewhere, scrolling the page does not remove it from the part of the page. Now, what I have always tried to use sticky with has been basically headers. Because, you know, when I'm working with something like this, I don't want that header to move off the screen like it is right now. All right, I want this to stay right here. Maybe move it up a little so it's like that, something like that. So as I scroll, this remains here, but the other information will eventually disappear. All right. Okay. Floating and clearing. It says floating and clearing has been an important topic in the past, especially when you float stuff left and right. All right. Basically, the float tries to stay in effect until you clear it, and that's what they're talking about here. It says that in the past, float was used a lot in hacks and creative usages. It's not used as much anymore because, again, you have flexbox and grid, which we'll talk about momentarily. You'll notice that the float property has 3 values. You can float left, you can float right, and when you clear, you float none. So it says, say we have a box with a paragraph with some text and also an image. So if you put it in like this, all right, so it says there's a paragraph and you put the image right inside of it and then you add some more text. Okay, you can play around with this and get the visual appearance to look like this. Probably at least not what you want. So as it says there, as you can see, the normal flow by default considers the image to be in line, so it makes space for it. If you add float left and you add some padding, notice the difference. You make the text, for lack of better words, the image flows around the text. And just as you did it with a float left, you can use a float right on it just as well. All right. So as mentioned there, a floated element is removed from the normal flow of the page and the other content will then flow around it. All right. You can, as mentioned here, you can float virtually anything. So here's an example right here. All right. So what do we have here? The image, we've got to float right. What if we just change that image to float left? All right, like that. See what happens. All right. Here it says we switch the image with a span element. All right, and the results look like this. So there, and sometimes you do this because, I mean, this could be an aside that you wanted floated, but, you know, to the right in this case, but you still, maybe this was going to be longer than that, maybe go halfway down here or whatever. You still want the other text to flow around it. So typically, when you do this kind of stuff, like I said, typically, you do it because it has different visual effects. So as it says, if you float more than one element, by default, the elements that you float are stacked up next to one another horizontally until there's no room, then they start on a new line. So it says there, say we had 3 images inside of a p tag. All right, there you go. That's what they are by default when they're basically inline. So if we add a float left, we get this. Probably, again, not exactly what we want. All right. If you add a clear left to the images, they're going to be stacked vertically rather than horizontally. So again, as always, it depends on what you want. All right. It says there I use the left value for clear. It allows left to clear left floats, right to clear right floats, both to clear both left and right. All right. And let's see, where am I here? Before we finish up in this particular lecture, let's talk a little bit about z-index, which I've already mentioned. All right, and as it says there, when we talked about positioning earlier, Copes mentioned that you can use the z-index property to control the z-axis positioning of elements. It says there it's very useful when you have multiple elements that overlap each other. You decide which one you want to stand out. In other words, which one you put into the foreground. When you set a z-index, it takes an integer value. Here's the key thing. The higher the z-index value, the more it is positioned nearer to the user. So in other words, if you've got a bunch of values and you're stacking them on top of one another, the one with the highest number z-index is going to appear the most in the foreground, followed by the one with the next highest z-index, followed by the one with the next highest z-index, etc., until you get to the bottom when you've got your lowest z-index, and that one will be the most in the background. When deciding which element should be visible and which should be positioned behind it, the browser does a calculation on the z-index value. Notice the default value is auto, a special keyword. So its position is determined by the position of the HTML element on the page. The last one appears first because it's defined last. All right, so they give examples here. I'm not going to go into any of this, okay? It says you use 10 and 20. You can use any number you want, including negative numbers. All right, now the next section that's in here is going to be on CSS Grid. It starts here, and it goes all the way to page 126. And then we're going to get on Flexbox. So what I'm going to do for right now is I'm going to stop lecturing. The next lecture then will be all on CSS Grid. The following one will be all on CSS Flexbox. These are going to be 2 lectures. This one again starts on 109 and it goes about 17 pages. Then the one on Flexbox is only about 13 or 14 pages. I would highly recommend, and I've got the URLs here, I'm going to ask that people in this class, the first day of class, I'd like you to sign up if you have not already for Wes Bose's CSS Grid course and Wes Bose's Flexbox course. Here are the 2 URLs, cssgrid.io and flexbox.io. And that will bring you I know I had them up here. There's CSS Grid, and there's Flexbox. Okay, so we're going to come back and talk about Grid in just a couple of moments.